session in Indonesian, and then I'm gonna do the two language thing. I'm gonna go bilingual later on. Baik, selamat pagi rekan-rekan semuanya, ibu, bapak, adik, kakak, teman-teman, para sahabat STFT Jakarta yang saya kasihi. Selamat datang di acara ini. Ini adalah acara percakapan daring yang kita lakukan bersama dengan Profesor Shelly Rambo dari Universitas Boston, dari Boston School of Theology. Pada kesempatan yang berbahagia ini, saya akan mengumumkan bahwa percakapan ini diinisiasi oleh Kak Septemmy dan kemudian juga diorganisir oleh Pusat Kajian Gender, Seksualitas, dan Trauma STFT Jakarta. So I just announced that this is an initiative made by Dr. Septemmy Lakawa, who is called Kak Septemmy locally in our own community. And this event is also organized by the Center for Gender, Sexuality, and Trauma Studies of Jika Anda Theological Seminary. And we are so deeply honored, we are so proud of having Dr. Shelly Rambo with us. And I must say that at the personal level, I'm very proud of you because I also imbibed your book, Spirit and Trauma, last year when I was part of the class on trauma, theology, and the aesthetic of healing. And I'll introduce our moderator, Kak Septemmy Lakawa. So Kak Septemmy is no stranger to all of us, or most of us, I guess. Reverend Dr. Septemmy Lakawa is the president of Jakarta Theological Seminary. She teaches missiology, ecumenism, feminist theology, and an elective called Trauma, Theology, and the Aesthetic of Healing, the class that also co-organized this talk. So I'm gonna show you the rules of the house, and I'm gonna read it in Indonesian. Teman-teman bisa men-share ya, yang tadi ya, yang rules of the house, yang peraturan-peraturan itu. Iya. Saya akan bacakan peraturan ini meskipun juga sudah ada di layar kita masing-masing. Saya akan tetap bacakan. Jika ada teman-teman yang lebih enak untuk mendengar, ini juga bisa lebih akomodatif bagi teman-teman. Para peserta diharapkan untuk mengganti nama sesuai format, nama, strip institusi. Atau kalau teman-teman ada yang datang mewakili pribadi, bisa langsung nama strip pribadi. Dan yang kedua, pastikan semua mikrofon berada dalam keadaan mute selama talk show berlangsung. Jadi para host dan para co-host memang bisa mem-mute teman-teman, akan tetapi ada baiknya jika kita sama-sama berkesadaran sendiri untuk mem-mute diri kita sendiri selama presentasi sedang berlangsung. Kalau teman-teman punya pertanyaan terkait diskusi ini, terkait presentasi Shelly Rambo nanti, teman-teman bisa langsung memposting pertanyaan teman-teman di chat room. Dan nanti pertanyaan teman-teman akan diadres oleh moderator. Dan teman-teman tentunya please be mindful juga karena pertanyaan-pertanyaan tentunya tidak akan semuanya bisa terjawabkan. Jadi akan ada pertanyaan-pertanyaan yang bisa dijawab, tapi akan ada juga pertanyaan-pertanyaan yang nggak bisa dijawab untuk saat ini. Okay. I'm gonna briefly give you a picture of how this session is going to be carried out. So first of all, we'll be having Professor Shelly Rambo to deliver her presentation for 45 minutes, to be followed by responses from Kak Temi, which will last for 15 minutes. And we'll be having plenty of time for Q&A, 50 minutes, and our talk will be concluded. And there's going to be a closing remarks or closing statements for 10 minutes. So without any further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Septemmy Lakawa, or Kak Temi. Kak Temi, the screen is yours. We usually say the floor is yours, right? But now, since we're doing this virtually, then I say the screen is yours.
Thank you, Amadeo. Selamat pagi semua. Selamat datang dalam percakapan kita pagi ini. This is the first time that STFT Jakarta is holding an online conversation on the focus on trauma and theology. And we are so grateful and we are honored and blessed to have Dr. Shelly Rambo to be with us at our first event. Let me introduce who she is. And if you ever ask why I'm interested on trauma studies and develop research and so on and so forth, who influenced me and who shaped this, this interest, this is the person, Professor Shelly Rambo. I worked with her when I was doing my doctoral student at Boston University School of Theology. Professor Joasa de Prasetya also was there. Professor Shelly Rambo was my second advisor for my dissertation, and I worked closely with her on this topic for the following years. She also came with her students in 2017 for 2 weeks with us, at the seminary. And also we went to Bandung and worked with Gereja Kristen Pasundan, and also to Ambon with UKIM and GPM. So perhaps some of you who are here met her already in 2017 with several of her students, and are excited will be able to hear directly from her. Of course, there will be not enough time for every questions to be responded later on. But also 2 of her works, Trauma and Spirit, and Resurrecting Wounds. Many of us have used those 2 books, but we are, I think I share the joy with everyone here, Dr. Rambo, to have you and to be able to listen from your presentation and from your stories, and also we'll be able later on to share some of our stories. So the screen is yours, and please.
Thank you so much. It's just it's delightful to be with you, and I'm hoping my technology works. I've tested it many times, but let's see. Let's see how we're doing here. And
your notes is still okay. Now it's okay. No,
it's good?
now it's fine. Now it's good.
Okay, good. So I just I'm thrilled to be here, and even though it's 9 o'clock at night and I'm usually heading to bed, it's really it's wonderful to engage you. It makes me want to come back to Indonesia. So I just want to say that I bring greetings from Boston University School of Theology. I talked with the Dean Mary Elizabeth Moore today, and she sends her greetings. Doctors Lakawa and Ada Prasetya are our most distinguished doctoral alums. So I really consider Jakarta Seminary as our sister school. And we started that active partnership when they started their doctoral programs. But we have continued that relationship. So through teaching and leadership of Dr. Lakawa, the seminary, your seminary, has really become a leader in theological education at the intersection of theological studies and the study of trauma. There's not that many people or that many schools who are doing that. So, so the work that you're doing at the seminary is very unique. So in 2017, as was mentioned, we brought a group of students from BU School of Theology to the seminary. And if you think about that timing, right, it was January 2017, and a group visited. It was less than 2 months after the 2016 national election in the United States, and just weeks before Donald Trump assumed office, right? So we didn't know at the time what would take place over the next 4 years. That was really 4 years ago. But we had some sense then that the study of trauma was important, and that religious communities would be particularly challenged in unprecedented ways. I could say a lot more. The challenge has been even more than we could have imagined. And the philosopher Paul Ricoeur always asked this question. He asked, from where are you speaking, right? And I'm aware, particularly now, in this moment and in this location, that I'm very much speaking from the situation in the United States, right? That we're aware very much of where we're situated in our work. So I'm aware of how much really we need the perspectives of sisters and brothers in other places, right? Not only of these valuable connections that we have with you in Indonesia, but also you serve as a source of great hope and deep hope for us about those global connections, many of which have been compromised over the last 4 years. So I just want to thank you in advance for extending that hand of friendship at a time when our country is not extending much friendship. So just wanted to start with that note. So I want to begin with this diagram. And it's been circulating in therapeutic or clinical communities. And it presents in a visual diagram form an attempt to distinguish between trauma, PTSD, and moral injury. So from 1980, which was the year that post-traumatic stress disorder was first kind of included in the diagnostic manual, when it really officially entered the clinical community, since 1980, the phenomenon of trauma has been defined and redefined, right? It's expanded, it's changed, it's had different developments in terms of the clinical definition. And there's been decades-long research on PTSD and its effects. There's active clinical clarification and debates about treatment, but the concept of moral injury is newer. And it's attributed to the war psychiatrist Jonathan Shay. And it speaks from what we could call the other side of violence, to name the impact of harm experienced by those who have enacted harm. So if trauma names the harm that we receive, moral injury names the harm that we perpetrate or participate in. So moral injury, as Jonathan Shay described it, refers to the damage that results when someone transgresses their sense of right and wrong. And Shay and other psychologists working with war veterans struggling, years after they come back from combat, years and even decades, these psychiatrists noted that the accounts of the veterans seem to be distinct from the fight, flight, freeze, or stress-based responses that were so central to the diagnosis of PTSD. So they're observing veterans coming back and saying something that they're experiencing doesn't quite fit the trauma diagnosis. So these after effects they discerned moral in nature and were expressed more in terms of guilt and remorse. So veterans were struggling with a sense of guilt for what they had done in war. The veterans were struggling with their sense of goodness. Am I a good person anymore because of what I've done? And struggled with a sense that they had violated their own principles and commitments. So Shea located the responsibility for moral injury in the military command. So since commanding officers were the ones who were giving the orders and were really responsible for keeping the rules of war, right? The rules of combat, the responsibility for moral injury was really located, Jonathan Shea thinks, in the structure of the military itself. So if the commanders are the ones who send people to war, they're responsible then for the impact of that, of whatever actions that are carried out in the name of the fighting country. So Shea's descriptions have since been developed in a more clinical direction, with moral injury becoming a more individualized diagnosis to name the psychological wounds of performing acts, right, that leave, in the words of someone like Nancy Sherman, she calls it moral residue, right? So there's some residue that remains after action has been carried out. But the shift from Jonathan Shea to this clinical definition means that the guilt or responsibility lies in the individual person. So I just want you to note that, because there's a shift from a structure, understanding that the structure of military command is responsible, to this shift to an individual diagnosis that the person who did the action bears the moral responsibility. So the guilt or remorse lies within the individual, and in this case, it's not the same as a stress-based response. So you may have symptoms of trauma, but it can't be reduced to that. So this notion that moral injury, distinct from trauma, is now moved into a psychological or clinical diagnosis is really interesting and highly debated, right? Because this puts moral injury in the realm of like the psychologist or the psychiatrist. So we should be interested in that, because often moral terrain is thought of as like the religious, right? Or the ethical. The ethicist and the religious people know something about this moral sphere, but suddenly this becomes very clinical territory. So what this looks like is clinicians facilitating a process of forgiveness, operating as what we might call secular priests, right? So the clinician or the therapist provides a process by which a person comes to see themselves as forgiven, right? And the proposed process is called adaptive disclosure. That's kind of the formal process of diagnosis and treatment, and it's associated with a person called Brett Litz. He's located in Boston, but it's the name that you'll hear most commonly. Not surprisingly, religious theologians and religious people were recognizing, yeah, this has something of a, this is in our territory. And so you have some works, theologians begin writing and speaking about what they call soul wounds, right? So these moral wounds from war seem to be wounds that lie in the soul. So this is a book by Rita Nakashima Brock. This cover, Rita Nakashima Brock and Gabriella Latini, both of whom are feminist theologians who are kind of entering the public conversation on moral injury. So since the publication of that book, people are interested in, okay, what are the implications of Jonathan Shea and Brett Litz's use of the term moral injury? So as COVID-19 cases begin to rise in the spring of 2020, and healthcare systems were at or over capacity, this is very true in the Boston area. We were an early site of the surge of COVID in the United States. And when you have this healthcare at its like maximum capacity, it's not surprising that references to moral injury within hospital or healthcare systems begin to rise. So healthcare professionals found themselves forced to make decisions about who received care amidst conditions of understaffing, right? The lack of protective PPE or protective equipment, and little, if not no, directives from the federal government. So the conditions of healthcare start to put pressure on providing health, and the term moral injury starts appearing, you know. So all of these point to a future moral impact in which the conditions for providing care are yielding, people are making decisions that may transgress their sense of right and wrong, right? So these pointed to the effects of compromised care and compromised care in situations in which, let's say you're a nurse at the hospital and you're instructed to carry out orders by a superior that may go against what you think is the best care that you could provide. So nurses are subordinate to doctors, just like military, the warrior is subject to their commanding officer. So you see that same structural analysis happening from the military. It's now being used to describe healthcare systems. So COVID is registering the time of the pandemic. The language of moral injury is just, it's contagious, right? That people are saying there seems to be all sorts of situations in which we're asked to carry out our work under these compromised situations. And we may look back and say that there's moral impact to the actions. So the political climate, I would say, in the United States has also been described in terms of moral injury. When the federal government is making decisions that dehumanize certain communities, and you're living under those conditions, is, a question to ask is our moral horizon being diminished by the actions, of our government? So the literatures, I think it's also been used to think about, the political situation, but also literatures on racial trauma are expanding to consider the moral injury of white body supremacy. So does moral injury connect to issues of racism? So I'm hoping that you're seeing some of these connections about why I'm talking about trauma and moral injury. It means that now when I'm in settings talking about trauma, I think these two are really, they're really connected, distinct, but connected. So these clinical terms, trauma and moral injury, are naming something broken in systems at large, right? Societal breaks. So they're clinical, but psychological terms, but are now naming something of like larger problems, national problems. But the terms trauma and moral injury really speak to more than just a break in a system. So we're familiar with language of something broken that needs repaired or a problem that needs solved. But trauma and moral injury speak to wounds that remain over time. So they don't just point to a problem in the present, but a problem of the past intruding into the present. So this raises a question: how do you deal with violent histories that are still impacting how we live and move in present life? So if you study trauma, the most basic thing you learn is that the past is not in the past. The past is in the present in an intrusive way, right? So that the timeline of how we think about past, present, and future is really challenged in trauma studies. So in early trauma studies, there was a shift from the language of recovery to the language of resilience, because the more we knew or learned about the phenomenon of trauma, the more we knew that there was not a definite end to the healing process. So recovery implies often closure or ending, like, the healing process, you've recovered from it. But the term resilience starts to replace this notion of recovery, because resilience speaks to capacities for living with the ongoing impact of trauma. So it has a quality that recognizes that something does not just end and you're done with that, but that resilience moves as, kind of thinking about healing as more a living with the ongoing effects of trauma. So I want to emphasize this here. When we talk about trauma and moral injury, we're really dealing with ongoing effects of harm or violence that may have happened years or decades ago. And for those within the context of the United States, these can often be marked by dates in our history that are not just dates in our history, but they symbolize the kind of traumatic history. So in the US context, it's 1619, right? When the first enslaved Africans landed by ship in the colony of Virginia. So when people say 1619, that registers not just a date in history, but a whole host of, it calls up a whole history, right? A history of racial oppression in the United States. So, for those within the Indonesian context, is, the question, is that date 1965, right? What are the dates in history that are not just dates, right? Yeah. But that events that continue to impact the present reality. So I want to just speak briefly about those ongoing effects by mentioning kind of three different features. And I think these three features bring together trauma and moral injury. You can let me know if they do or don't. So I think one of the features that I want to just draw out is the feature of denial, or what I'll call the dialectic, or what Judith Herman calls the dialectic of trauma. So physical wounds you can see, right? And you can treat. Psychological trauma is often referred to as invisible wounds. You can't see them, right? They're not visible. So you may not even know that others may not know they're there. And this problem of invisibility and making the wounds of trauma visible is a central problem, right, of when you're dealing with trauma. So I'm thinking of Elaine Scarry's insight in the book The Body and Pain, and she says, you know, the pain is incommunicable, right? In a way that I can stand next to Dr. Lakawa, right? And she can be in incredible pain, and I may not, and I don't know it, right? That the invisibility of it to me presents a challenge that is often at the heart of trauma. You can't see it, so it's not there. So I think what Judith Herman says is there's both a need for the survivor herself to expose that pain and trauma. At the same time, there's a desire not to know. Yeah. So there's a need to know and expose it, make it visible, and then there's the desire not to know or to hide it. That's the dialectic. So that goes on not only in the individual who experiences that trauma, but then it goes on externally as the public, you know, makes visible trauma at certain moments in history, but then doesn't want to know. And I think this dialectic is what makes it so hard to think about trauma healing, because at the heart of it, there's a desire not to know, even by those who survive themselves. So I wanted to just, this quote is, we could just unpack this the whole session, right? One of the things that happens to victims of life-threatening, extremely traumatic events is that they often cannot bear to remember what happened. And when they themselves are in denial of what happened, and others collude in that denial because bystanders can't bear to believe what happened, the victim begins to doubt his or her own sensations or perceptions. So the person loses a kind of agency. They lose faith in their perceptions. This to me is a quote that just speaks about that dialectic, right? And how the person herself doesn't want to know, right? And others around her don't want to know, right? And this is even more interesting because it was written by Jessica Stern, who is known as a national security specialist. She interviews terrorists. Her job is to interview terrorists, and she says that what she finds at the heart of interviewing terrorists is their own experience of shame. And so you could also put shame is also part of that dynamic of not wanting to know, because of the deep humiliation or shame of having experienced what you experienced. So there's a shame humiliation dynamic that I think is important here. And I think I think of this as a challenge when we think about religious communities, or I think of testimonies I hear from people who experience trauma but find that their religious communities don't want to know about it. And that often religious communities are good places to keep secrets.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And so that to me is a serious challenge to many of us in religious or theological circles, that this dynamic of making visible traumatic histories my question is, are our communities safe places to tell those truths, right? So what it takes is a capacity to see what we don't want to see, and to instill trust in people's perceptions, right? Because they lose faith in their own perceptions. So there's so much in that quote that that I think it speaks about the challenge of, when trauma is made visible, I'm always waiting for it to go back into hiding, right? Because if that's the dialectic, the visibility may be momentary, and that I think in my context, we're very quick fix, slow, short attention span, you know, all the stereotypes of Americans, maybe. You know, it's just we don't linger too long on things, and that makes it very hard that trauma surfaces, but then it goes back below the surface. So denial is, I think, that first dynamic, first aspect that I want to show. The second is really, we know so much about trauma's impact on the body. We know a lot more than we did even 20 years ago. This is the arena of neurobiology. We just know a lot more about how trauma impacts the brain. And we know from the science that we store memories in our bodies, in the non-declarative, right? In the non-declarative, as non-declarative memories. And that trauma is an overactivation of our limbic system, which is our fight flight. It's the part of our brain where we register danger. And we know that the fight flight system, or the limbic system, is continually activated in cases of trauma. So a kind of hyper overdrive of the fear-based responses of the body. And we know that this kind of wears down our ability to respond, you know, over time. It wears down our ability to respond to danger and threat, right? So it wears down and shows up in you know, different symptoms, but often disease, you know, over long term, it can do a lot of damage. So trauma is stored as body memories and is not processed in our frontal lobe, right? The area of our brain that assigns language and meaning to the experience. So if trauma is stored in our fear emotional part of the brain and not registered in language, the big insight from that is that you can't talk trauma out of the body, right? So traditionally, the approach was to work with survivors to recover the story of what happened, right? If you could remember the story and speak the story, that was the process of kind of therapeutic healing. But we know now that unless we find ways of targeting or restoring safety to the body, grounding in breath and working with sensations, that you can talk all you want, right? But trauma will remain lodged in the neural pathways that are created, you know, with kind of ongoing sensory triggering.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a lot of the insight that Dr. Lakawa has really taken seriously in thinking about. We need to retrain our bodies and not just change our minds, right? And to think about what that means for traditions that have been very word-centered and very language-centered. So that's the second area. The third is that trauma has often been described in terms of an event. So there's been a shift in understandings of trauma. Originally, you thought there was a traumatic event that happened. The experience of that event, did significant damage, and then you have an after the event in which you kind of engage in the healing process. But there's more attention in trauma to thinking of trauma as a series of events. So not single event, but events or as ongoing conditions of violence and vulnerability. So this is often registered under the term insidious trauma. It's a term used to consider, for example, what it would mean to be identified within one society with a minority status, right? Because of your identity, you're more likely to be you're more vulnerable to harmful events that may happen around you. So I was thinking, recalling when we did the seminar in Indonesia, this may be related, say, to being someone of Chinese descent, right? So there's stigma associated with identity. So in the US, it'd be being African American, right? That because of one's identity, one is more likely to be harmed or vulnerable to harm. That's not an event. It may be a series of events, but it's actually more like conditions of living that people who are working in the area of trauma are less and less thinking about trauma as single event. So if trauma is insidious and ongoing, that means that a healing process can't really follow that before and after timeline. So we need to move then. There's no kind of shortcuts because healing will require sustained attention to the ways that events impact health and livelihood. So another way of thinking about insidious trauma is to think about the experience of poverty, right? That having depleted resources over periods of time can produce the same kind of symptoms as you see in people who experience PTSD. So I think this is just a shift that's happened. Thinking in terms of microaggressions, a term that's used quite a lot here. What does it mean, living and moving in conditions in which you're always perceived as an outsider or marginalized? Okay. So these three, the denial, the somatic, and really the insidious, or this need to think of trauma as something that's more sustained. These three present opportunities and challenges to religious communities, all of whom provide frameworks. Our theological or religious communities provide frameworks for interpreting human suffering and responding to it. So Dr. Lakawa and other theologians working in the area of trauma recognize that something more is needed from our religious and theological traditions if we want to do healing work, right? So witness, both Dr. Lakawa and I have focused on the theological concept of witness. And witness is a concept that is at the heart of trauma studies. What does it mean to witness trauma? But it's also at the heart for both of us as theologians of Christianity. It's central to our narratives. It's central to how we understand ourselves positioned in relationship to others, to the world. So if we develop this concept with attention to their meanings in both of these settings, right? That both within the world of trauma and the world of faith, if we bring them together, there's greater ability to respond to trauma in a kind of partnering relationship. So religious and spiritual care providers working with mental health providers. So witness refers to a posture. This is the quote that I have on this PowerPoint. Witness refers to a posture towards trauma that makes visible what we don't want to see, right? That addresses denial, that takes the body as a site of knowing, and that enables us to stay with pain and transform it without glorifying it. There's a lot loaded in the last thing that I said, right? Is to stay with pain, right? Because we don't want to see it, but to participate in the transformation of pain without glorifying it. And that's, Dr. Lakawa will hear in that statement the concern that often Christian theology takes pain and can rise above it, can glorify it in the process. So there's some cautions that theologians working in the area of trauma theology would provide some correctives on the way that our theological traditions have talked about suffering. So that's where when you bring together trauma and a theological tradition, they don't always go nicely together, right? It produces some challenge and I think healthy tension. So when the Gospels in the Christian tradition point to the way of being in the aftermath of the death of Jesus of the cross, they point to this witness. So this is in Dr. Lakawa's work and also my own, that each of the Gospels, right, has these stories that are incredibly rich for thinking about what does it mean, what posture does one have towards trauma. Like, how would they connect to denial, right? To the somatic, and then to think about insidious trauma. So we often ascribe, when we read the Jesus story, we certainly understand that Jesus, for example, was a healer in his life and ministry. But we often conclude that understanding of Jesus as healer when we begin to talk about his death and resurrection, because he shifts from healer to savior. But what if all of it is healing? Right? This is the question that I ask. Why the savior has salve, right? Salve, tending wounds in the very word, but suddenly death and resurrection becomes about something else. So in my work, I really read the cross and resurrection accounts as Jesus as healer. What is he teaching them? He returns with his wounds visible to teach them how to tell the truth about wounds, right? So that people working in trauma theology are reading their sacred texts with these kind of questions. So and certainly in Resurrecting Wounds, in the book that I wrote, I never used the term moral injury. It wasn't kind of on my radar. But that thinking about a community gathered around wounds that are still visible, what does it mean to be faced with the harm that you have enacted, right? So there's a calling out in that communal story in the Gospel of John that may speak to moral injury. These are the questions that we would ask. So if we consider both trauma and moral injury together, I really think it speaks to more the need for spiritual conditioning, like a spiritual workout plan to really sustain attention to wounds. Think about denial. What we want to turn away. What would enable us to turn towards pain, right? We're going to need deep spiritual practices for that. Okay, so I don't have that much more time, but I don't need more time. Huh?
Please continue.
Okay, I'm just gonna. So my most recent work, this is even since I visited you in Indonesia, my most recent work has been working with chaplains. Mm-hmm. So partnering in the work of care, there are those who partner in the work of care with social workers, mental health providers. They work in hospitals, prisons, the military, airports, fire, they work with a fire department, police department. So these folks who work alongside other care providers have become kind of increasingly of interest to me, right? They're the secular priests in one sense. They work they work outside of religious communities. These spiritual care providers really work at the intersection of mental health and spiritual health. And so within the United States, within the context of the US, the Western medical model, right? These diagnostic categories are just dominant. They're the way that we measure health through a diagnostic frame. So it's important and yet often challenging to advocate for spiritual care and health. That language has often been, you can speak that language, but you can speak it in the temple, you can speak it in the synagogue, or you could speak it in the church, but you can't speak it, that's not the language that we use. So if the dominant language is the clinical language, chaplains are really working in under the kind of psychological categories and trying to articulate what it means to provide spiritual care. So these frames for naming suffering have been of interest to theologians, not simply who work, many of whom work specifically within psychology and theology. But I think I'll be interested to hear Dr. Lakawa talk about it. Neither she nor I are kind of trained specifically in psychology and theology. So we've been asking for a kind of a broadening of how we think about, spiritual care in terms of thinking of drawing from the rich kind of narrative traditions that really speak about the experience of being human. And when you start using, and when I move in, I'm doing a lot more, making a lot more appearances in hospitals, not so much since COVID, but I'm interested in hearing how strange and welcomed it is to use the language of what does it mean to be human. I mean, that's really what we're, you know, and what does it mean to be in pain? And what does it mean to offer compassion and empathy? These are not just psychological questions. These are like human questions. So that theology at its best speaks into these questions of existence. And it speaks in ways that are rich and often very storied. And when you use it, when you use that language, it provides a kind of humanizing, non-pathologizing effect. So I think theology really contributes the filling out of that diagnostic frame that for often people can find that you know, they're diagnosed with a disorder, and often that you know, theologians will say the experience of being human involves pain or involves suffering. And so the very approach of theological and religious caregivers may offer other pathways besides a kind of stigma of a diagnosis, right? It offers a different frame. And I use frames here because I think of it as offering a different framing for how we think about suffering. And also theology at its best is not driven by providing explanation or solution. Theological traditions invite us to think about what we don't know, right? The divine. So that the engagement, I think, with mystery and not knowing is comfortable territory for theologians in a way that I think our ability to meet people in pain without trying to kind of solve it or cure it provides is what theology can contribute. So I wanted to end with just some images that I took away from Indonesia about I think Dr. Lakawa, I think the thinking about what art and aesthetics provides in that not knowing, that space. I'm thinking about the moving in the realm of mystery, that art or aesthetics can hold that unknowing. But it also provides, you know, pathways or routes to imagining new possibilities. So so those images are ones that I took from the community, in which you have tangible, visible representations of both suffering, histories of suffering, events of suffering, but also through the process of art or craft or making something, also holds that suffering, but also provides kind of a different mark of possibility into the future. Okay.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Okay. Okay.
Oh, now I can see everybody again. Even better.
I'll try to summarize just a little bit in Bahasa Indonesia, so at least everyone can have at least similar understanding or the general overview of what you just said. Profesor Rambo sudah menyampaikan ke kita sangat kaya materi yang beliau sampaikan. Selama ini riset beliau adalah tentang trauma, Tapi dalam beberapa waktu terakhir, beliau menghubungkan isu besar lainnya yaitu moral injury. Jadi seperti luka secara moral, atau apa yang kemudian didefinisikannya sebagai ketidakmampuan orang untuk lagi membedakan mana yang benar, mana yang salah. Atau kemampuan orang untuk membedakan mana yang benar dan yang salah itu dirusak akibat peristiwa-peristiwa kekerasan. Lalu dari sana dia melihat bahwa sebenarnya baik moral injury dan trauma itu berbeda. Tapi melalui penelitiannya yang terbaru ini, dia mau memperlihatkan bahwa sangat berkoneksi antara moral injury dan trauma. Pengalamannya dia bicara dari konteksnya di Amerika Serikat, memperlihatkan bahwa moral injury itu sebenarnya sebelumnya dilihat sebagai bagian dari sistem, dari struktur, khususnya dalam konteks militer. Tapi ternyata pada beberapa waktu terakhir ada pergeseran dari moral injury itu yang tadinya istilah atau terminologi dalam konteks ketidakmampuan struktur dalam struktur militer misalnya, ketika orang melakukan kekerasan dan seterusnya. Nah, beberapa waktu terakhir itu ada pergeseran ke terminologi yang lebih psikologis, klinis dia. Jadi mendekati sebenarnya terminologi dari trauma itu sendiri. Nah, artinya adalah ketidakmampuan orang lagi atau rusaknya kemampuan orang untuk membedakan mana yang benar dan mana yang salah, memperlihatkan bahwa moral injury itu adalah kekerasan yang kita teruskan kepada orang lain, sementara trauma adalah kekerasan yang ditimpakan pada kita. Nah, ada dialektika di antaranya, dan beliau memfokuskan diri di situ. Bagaimana ini? Sekarang kita menengahinya. Lalu dalam percakapannya dia membedakan dalam konteks COVID, dia membedakan dan memperlihatkan bahwa isu moral injury itu juga ada. Misalnya kepada para tenaga medis, ketika mereka harus mengambil keputusan, siapa yang harus segera ditolong. Dan kita sementara, saya hubungkan dengan kita di Indonesia, kita sedang menghadapi situasi seperti ini. Siapa yang segera harus ditolong? Nah, nanti pertanyaan-pertanyaan ini akan muncul, misalnya ketika vaksin datang ya, siapa yang harus segera diberikan, dan seterusnya. Nah, ada 3 penanda yang difokuskan oleh Dr. Rambo, yaitu dalam konteks trauma dan bagaimana dia memengaruhi hidup kita. 1 itu denial, jadi menolak. Kita menolak bahwa memang ada trauma. Dan ini dia perlihatkan sebagai dengan mengutip beberapa teori, salah satunya dari Judith Herman, bahwa inilah dialektika trauma. Trauma itu seperti kita mau trauma itu diceritakan, tapi pada saat yang sama kita nggak mau itu diketahui. Jadi perasaan-perasaan seperti ini yang juga tertimpakan pada tubuh kita. Nah, denial itu juga memperlihatkan bahwa pengaruhnya sangat besar pada diri kita. Ada keinginan untuk supaya orang lain tahu, tapi ada juga hasrat untuk tetap dia sembunyi. Jadi bolak-balik antara proses seperti ini yang akan sangat menyulitkan, karena salah satunya adalah shame, rasa malu. Apalagi jika itu dialami oleh korban trauma. Lalu yang kedua, somatik. Jadi fisiologi, tertimpanya persoalan trauma itu pada tubuh kita. Lalu tadi dijelaskan tentang fungsi otak. Trauma itu tersimpan di 2 bagian otak kita, tengah dan belakang. Yang belakang itu lebih pada semacam antena kita, ada bahaya dan seterusnya. Dan trauma tidak tersimpan di memori depan kita, bagian otak kita, yang memiliki kemampuan untuk membahasakan. Nah, akibatnya karena tidak ada bagian dari otak itu yang bisa membahasakan trauma, maka trauma itu turun ke tubuh kita. Itu artinya orang yang mengalami trauma bisa kelihatan atau bisa mengalami jejaknya itu pada tubuhnya sendiri. Dan dia memberi contoh yang ketiga, yaitu Insidious Trauma. Trauma yang terus berlangsung karena identitas kita. Tadi diberi contoh, misalnya untuk di Indonesia, kita menstigma orang dan pada akhirnya stigma itu menjadi trauma untuk orang tersebut. Misalnya orang yang di stigma lalu menjadi bullying, korban bullying, Cina, lalu PKI, macam-macam. Dan sekarang juga tentang LGBT dan seterusnya. Nah, oleh karena itu, masalah dari 3 penanda trauma ini adalah bagaimana kita merespons kekerasan dalam sejarah kita atau sejarah bangsa kita yang sebenarnya terus mengganggu bahkan merusak hidup kita sekarang. Jadi inclusive way. Nah, lalu dikatakan dalam studi trauma sebelumnya yang ditekankan adalah bahasa tentang pemulihan, recovery, sembuh. Tapi sebenarnya sudah shifting, sekarang yaitu adalah resilience. Resilience bagaimana kita punya daya juang, daya hidup pada situasi-situasi yang sulit, dan bagaimana kita hidup pada saat yang sama, efek dari trauma itu terus berlangsung, terus terjadi pada kita. Nah, oleh karena itu dia membandingkan dua contoh. Pada konteks sejarah trauma pada konteks Amerika Serikat itu adalah sejarah dimulainya perbudakan pada tahun 1690 abad 17 yang sampai sekarang masih dirasakan dengan isu racism, Black Lives Matter dan seterusnya. Sementara dan itu pada konteks opresi rasial pada konteks Indonesia pada pengalaman 1965 misalnya. Bagaimana dia memengaruhi sejarah kita ketika ada orang-orang yang dituduh Pkgst stigma, tapi kita tidak melihat sebagai bahwa trauma itu mempunyai efek yang besar untuk siapapun kita sampai pada saat ini. Nah, oleh karena itu, dia bertanya bagaimana teologi dalam konteks seperti ini. Bagaimana teologi memberi sumbangsih. Salah satu yang dia perlihatkan adalah dari teori witness, penyaksian, merujuk pada beberapa bagian dari Injil, dan mengatakan sebenarnya Yesus selama ini digeser gitu fungsinya, dia dari seorang pemulih penyembuh menjadi savior. Jangan-jangan menurut Profesor Rambo ini semua cerita tentang pemulihan, dan kita tidak boleh melihat bahwa savior itu lalu mengabaikan peran Yesus yang sebenarnya adalah seorang healer. Nah, lalu dia mengatakan yang kita juga perlu pikirkan adalah soal mental health dan spiritual health, khususnya untuk konteks pandemi. Bagaimana nih orang-orang yang studi teologi atau orang-orang dalam komunitas agama bisa melihat bahwa bagian dari tanggung jawab kita sebagai komunitas beragama, bukan cuma Kristen ya, jadi lintas iman, adalah memberikan perhatian secara spiritual, sementara kita seringkali tidak menyadari bahwa pengalaman-pengalaman trauma, pengalaman merasakan sakit, dan seterusnya itu pengalaman yang sangat manusiawi, yang membuat kita sungguh manusia. Dan itu yang dia ingin tahu sebenarnya, bagaimana teologi merespons konteks-konteks seperti itu. Dan yang terakhir dia tutup dengan mau mencari tahu bagaimana seni, apakah seni dan aesthetics itu juga bisa memberi ruang bagi pengalaman-pengalaman yang tak terketahui. Seperti tadi ya, rasa sakit, trauma itu tidak bisa dikomunikasikan, pada saat yang sama kita rasakan, dan apakah seni bisa memberi ruang untuk pengalaman not knowing itu bisa dialami juga sebagai bagian dari proses pemulihan. Nah, itu summary saya, bagaimana saudara-saudari dalam waktu kurang lebih 5 menit bisa selesai disarikan. Sebentar kita akan ada bagian dari tanya jawab, but I just summarize your presentation in less than 10 minutes. I took notes. Let me begin, because we still have how long, Dale? We have about 40 minutes.
We have about 40 minutes.
40 minutes with discussions, yeah?
Yes.
So let me ask, perhaps not a question, but like a comment for your presentation, and especially on terms of moral injury. I kind of like predict it will be part of your third book on moral injury, perhaps, and we are looking forward to having it. I think it is quite fascinating when you show us the distinction, but also the interconnection, interrelation between trauma and moral injury. And this is me just thinking out loud. Whether or not we can identify the gap between, or the shift that it takes place when survivors of violence, having experienced this trauma for so many years, when does or what triggers the shift from having to take care of one's body and experience, and then it shifts into perpetuating the similar harm for others. I remember because in my last class a couple of weeks ago, or last week, on trauma and theology, we delve into Annie Rogers' book, The Unsayable. You're the one who introduced the book also to me. And there, Annie Rogers told about the story of young girls who are the victims of sexual violence. And in order to communicate the uncommunicability of that event, that tragic event, she then perpetuating that harm to other, younger girls. And so my curiosity is, how do we deal with that it seems to me there is that gap when one person could just shift and then can come back, but then shift again into perpetuating the violence. Can you please respond to that?
Yes, and I think I mentioned at one point how central the experience of shame is to the experience of trauma. So so this speaks to a cycle. What you're talking about is a cycle in which if one has been deeply shamed, which James Gilligan calls a death of a self, one, or a dehumanization, where one has experienced profound disregard. These are ways of naming shame. An attempt to overcome shame is often violence. So what's interesting is that shame is an experience of towards oneself. It's often internalized, and often the posture is hiding, right? So the experience of shame on an individual level, or if we talk collectively, the experience of a humiliation of a people or a group, like same thing, but on a collective and individual level. Often the attempt to externalize, right, to get away from the experience of shame is often violence, which means then the shame cycle continues. So in an attempt to overcome your own shame, you humiliate someone else or another people group. This is James Gilligan's thesis that unattended shame, right? If you don't address shame, the cycles of violence will continue. I think that's what you're talking about at one level, which is how do you break the cycle that often exists when victims become perpetrators? And the generous way of reading that is that someone is trying to become a self when they have been devalued or disregarded. So Rich, I think it's in the Gilligan, talks about this. This is the primary Cain and Abel story in the Hebrew Bible, right? That it says, and there's a disregard that happens in that story, and that experience can only be undone by the act of violence, but it doesn't undo it, right? It just continues the cycle. I think that's why I think shame is so, most of our religious traditions focus on guilt. Guilt is an external, I did something bad. Shame is I am bad. So how do you get rid of the feeling of such profound shame? I think it's a way of naming why people groups fight against people groups. If your group has been humiliated, it often leads to aggression against others. Does that address what you're...
I think it is true, because this is my last part, Amadeo, because I think in the process of trying to overcome violence, and also Annie Rogers informs us, based on her reading on Lacan, that violence is a part of a language structure, the grammar of people trying to put words into what is unknowable, into things that are unsayable. So if we look at violence as a different dimension of traumatic language, I think,
Right.
there has to be a different approach to overcome violence. We cannot only do it as a criminal actions, but we also put a broader perspective on it as if it is a way of people to tell us what has happened to themselves or to the community, in what ways that we can develop a theological understanding of how do we frame anew this violence, because I don't think the cross has provided us with that, with sufficient understanding when violence has become a different language which is traumatized, or it is a traumatic language. And if you can respond to that just a little bit, and then I'll offer it to Amadeo.
I do, you're the one who can answer about the cross because you've been thinking about that longer. But I do think this is part of staying with pain, is you are giving a profoundly generous reading of violence, right? You're saying you're reading the language of violence in a way that humanizes those who do violence. And that, I raised this question with my class this week, which is, if you take this cycle of humiliation, shame, violence seriously, you have empathy for those who perpetrate harm. And that is going to seem to victims like are you not holding them accountable for what they've done? And this is where I think the moral injury questions are very interesting, because if you hold trauma and moral injury together, you have to think about accountability. How does accountability then, Dr. Lakawa, fit into empathy, understanding of this language of violence, but then what does accountability or responsiveness then, responsibility look like in that, as the complement to empathy?
Yeah.
You
It
can
is
answer
the
that.
dialectical between of redemptive violence and violence as traumatic language of concept. I think how do you respond that without jumping into the cross and violence as redemptive? And that's,
I do think that the need to rethink forgiveness, reconciliation, all of that's when you shift from trauma to moral injury, you're in that territory of a kind of rethinking of redemptive suffering. And I've always seen the cross and resurrection as kind of telling that fuller story.
Thank you so much. Okay, Amadeo, back to you.
All right, thank you very much, Professor Rambo, for your presentation, and Kak Temi for your summary and also for your responses. We've got a couple of questions, and in the interest of time, I think we can just respond to 3 questions first. I'm gonna read the questions. So there's a question from Maria Komboy from UKDW, Universitas Kristen Duta Wacana Christian University. Professor Rambo, thank you very much for your presentation. I am Insos from Papua. I am much interested in discussing violence at my homeland towards civilians, especially the indigenous people. I would like to know your opinion about the traumatic experience time
with indigenous communities. So that's how I hear your question, is that it's not enough to just pray about it as if God will take care of correcting that long history. I think we really are talking about what does it mean to seriously account for the fact that that history is still part of the way that you live and move in Papua, right? That something of those relationships are still not right, and that it's not just something in the past we can let go. So it sounds like I would want to know what kind of prayer. I'm not dismissing that prayer is unimportant, but does prayer have an ethic at the center of it as well?
Okay.
Thank you for your
I didn't see
response.
Maria, but I hope that was helpful.
I hope it's helpful because it's helpful for me. Okay, Amadeo, next.
Right. The second question comes from Aulia Sitomeang. Aulia is a student at Jakarta Theological Seminary, 3rd year. Thank you, Dr. Rambo, for the fruitful presentation. My question is, what are the elements that we need as theologians to construct the suffering element from theology of the cross that is traumatic experience friendly, or maybe friendly towards people with traumatic experience? Do you want to answer this question?
Yeah, I will. I'm also seeing these wonderful people like Irene and Eodia, and anyway, just saying hi to my friends from. Okay, I actually, one of the things that I don't develop as well, but that comes from my colleague Willie Jennings, who's a theologian at Yale. He really, it's a little bit in my work, but he challenges us to think about if we think of the cross as the site of holding pain, that if Christ is the one who holds the pain, there's also a message that says God remembers. So that it's also a site of not only pain, but a site of remembrance and of holding that memory. And he can talk more about it, but I think, I've really focused on thinking, between kind of cross and resurrection. So I think of the site of transformation as all of those moments together, right? If we think about the Jesus story as life, death, resurrection, this is just my good feminist theology, right? It's feminist theology says, why the death, the central focus? Why not the life? And that you need the life on either ends, right? The birth, the life, the ministry, and then the commissioning of the community to remember the death, right? That this is from remember the death, a death that you could not hold when it was actually happening. This is how I read the Gospel of John. that in John 17, Jesus lets them know that they'll miss the very event that they will have to witness, right? He says, you won't know what's happening at the time, but I'll send the Parakletos, the advocate, the witness, to bear witness to the things that you could not, witness at the time. That's a traumatic. So in some ways, I don't know that I'm helping you, but I'm saying the death is in some way not known by those who witnessed it. So the unknowing of what of the pain, to me, says the challenge is that you need the accompaniment of the spirit or the advocate to not only hold the gaze on the pain, right? This is James Cone, right? You need even the spirit to witness or hold the gaze on the suffering, and also the spirit to transform it. So that's a reading of the spirit at the cross, in the cross, through the cross, that to me is never just Jesus, right? If you read that as the God event or a Trinitarian event, what has been most missed about reading of the cross is the pneumatological, right? Is the spirit or pneuma, the breath of witness that the women hold, right? The gasp of the last breath released and the breath. So I don't know if that helps your constructive theology of the cross, but to me, so much of it has been read without that spirit component.
Yeah.
And for Christian theologians, it's very significant to think of that spirit as the Holy Spirit. Or in Jewish traditions, of course, they don't read the cross in the same way, but they have the tabernacling, the spirit that moves in the wilderness, right? That moves in the valley of the dry bones. So it's a spirit infused Christology for all you systematic theologians.
Okay.
Thank you, Professor Rambo. There is one question from Joseph Sambiri. Dr. Shelly Rambo, I'm very enthusiastic about your presentation. My name is Joseph Sambiri from Jakarta. I have a friend who experienced trauma because she experienced sexual violence. She is a survivor of rape or victim of rape. Is it enough just to pray for this friend of Joseph and make disciples? What tips or steps should be taken for the recovery of a victim of trauma resulting from rape? Thanks, Jesus bless. Actually, this question is similar with Maria's question. But the issue of sexual violence is rampant in Indonesia, and we know that there is a bill draft addressing sexual violence that hasn't been passed by the parliament. There are still obstacles in the passing of the bill. So this is a very salient issue in Indonesia. Can you respond to this question, Professor Rambo?
It is a similar question to Maria's question, which I would say it's not enough just to be prayed for. So it's important to think about from within the lens of faith, right? I don't know if he's asking it, but to think about what is the understanding of the harm to one as the harm to all, right? If it's thinking about a collective body, this is the somatic move, right? Is to say that if we really take seriously the harm, the somatic or the body, you know, how does that also help us advocate for very, very particular forms of harm done to the body? But also sexual violence is so much about power and control. So how do we think about coercion and dominance and control? And what's so important in terms of sexual violence is the significance of agency. So I would really want to know that in the dynamic of power and control that often operates within religious communities as well, but in what you would want to have a set of questions to think about what restores a sense of agency, both voice for this woman, and the ability to move and be safe in her environment, and the capacity to restore trust in one's own body. In trauma research, that is primary. And not trying to fix the situation or to figure out, not trying to fix the story or to find out what happened. Often people want to know what happened. If you're focused really on thinking about how do we restore for this woman a sense of safety in her body and in her environment, and what is the role that we can play in both of those things, if we really understand the integrity of the body in our religious and theological traditions. So I would say like bodily safety and environment safety. And so I would ask a certain set of questions, but I don't want to say more than that, because I would really want to know more about this woman.
Okay.
Right. There is now we open the second term of the Q&A, and there is a question from Nisa Janice. When we read the text, the horror text in the Bible, I personally believe that we also feed our brain or the limbic system with, if I may say, poisoning things too. How do we take care of ourselves to be able to witness the horror text of the Bible with or without diving too deeply into our personal trauma? Thank you very much.
Hi, Nissa. This is something that both Dr. Lakawa and I have, and all of us who study and take seriously trauma have to be concerned about the fact that when you enter into the study itself, it impacts you. That it's not an innocent subject, right? So when you move into stories of pain and stories of horror and stories of suffering, it changes the way you view the world. I mean, I have to say that it does two things. It also negative impact, so you have to protect yourself from despair or re-triggering for many of us experiences that we have had. But it also, I think on the other side, offers me a very generous understanding of like how amazing people are, that they move in the world with so much pain. So there's two sides of that, which is my ability to understand how much people can be harmed also generates a deep sense of wonder at how those same people have the capacity for relationship and love. And so that's the positive side of what I think is something that you have to have a set of spiritual practices that ground you to read those horror stories, right? And good systems like of accountability that people can notice when you're not doing well, right? So infusions, I call them joy infusions, that I recommend for myself and others, is that you need to have the joy and sources of joy and strength and love and support to go into that pain. And that trying to figure out to balance that is part of the work of being a healer in whatever way, whether you're teaching or doing ministry. You know, self-compassion, these are terms that psychologists will use. Self-compassion, empathy, those are also theological, but also not exclusive.
Thank you, Professor Rambo. There is a question from Lina Gunawan. She's a pastor at GKI Kayu Putih, a church in Indonesia. Dr. Rambo, thank you for your great presentation. I'm so glad to meet you through this Zoom platform. I appraise your works that help me to get the theological, critical thinking of trauma. I am curious about collective trauma, especially in a community that has several traumatic events like Indonesia. What are the main differences between individual and collective traumas? Do you think we can apply the theological approach for individual trauma you wrote in those two books to the collective or communal trauma?
Thank you, Lena. I mean, I think this is a challenge for the field of psychology because so much of trauma, so much of it is individualized. So to move from the interpersonal to the collective is a challenge kind of in the literatures of trauma. But now I think so much there's a lot on collective trauma. A lot of it is very location specific, right? It's done in the countries or the places around certain events, because I think the environmental factors of culture and location are so much a part of collective, you know, and analyzing collective trauma or social trauma. I think you have many layers, right? Interpersonal, institutional. So for instance, when if you're in a church culture, I would want to know the history of that congregation, because you also understand how institutions can, especially these cycles of denial and visibility and invisibility. So you have institutional history, then you have, you know, societal or national. I mean, it was very productive for me to be in Indonesia and to think about Indonesian history, religion in Indonesia, and to think about collective trauma in your context. There are some similar dynamics in collective trauma. I think shame and humiliation is a cycle that you can analyze from individual to collective. But one thing that's happening is, I think the kind of generative teaching that we did, Dr. Lakawa, when we had our students come, and you have like there's American history with its indigenous erasure of indigenous, you know, there's present forms of caste system and racism that would also be true in the Indonesian context. So one of the things that's so productive about thinking about collective trauma, thinking about Michael Rothberg's work on multi-generation, he calls it multi-directional memory. And what's so productive is that often when you're in the context of thinking about your collective trauma, you can't see what you can't see, right? But someone from Indonesia says, isn't it interesting that in the United States you have this problem? And there's something productive, I think, about even if there's such specific dynamics to the events, there's something that's shared, and that you need the cross engagement in order to cut those cycles of denial, right? So I think multi-directional memory is a way of saying there are some things about collective trauma. You don't just have individual trauma and then collective trauma. There's like collective trauma and individual trauma operating within the collective trauma. So I would ask, in the case of sexualized violence, why in Indonesia is sexual violence the rates rising, right? And is it connected to long histories that are particular to the Indonesian context? So what are the conditions in which sexualized violence within the Indonesian context becomes a particularly salient problem? So trauma researchers would say that history goes a long way back. There's a present dynamic, but that often it's rooted in a collective problem. So you would look at, histories of coercion and domination, power and control that are in the collective history that are impacting the dynamics of sexualized violence that are in the present.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think I directly answered that, but
I think you did.
There was a lot more to that.
Actually, Lina is in the US now. She's doing her Ph.D. at Berkeley and focusing on trauma and homiletics. And she will join your program, I think, at the end of this year, she told me.
So Lina is getting a really interesting view of the United States right now. So, I'm very sorry. We're not at our best. That's okay. A kind way of saying
You're still human. Okay, Deo, can we take just one more question? Because
yes, one more question from Pak Didik asked his question in Bahasa Indonesia, and I'd like to try to summarize the question and render it to English. Dr. Shelly Rambo, in the post-resurrection narrative, I hope I can read my own writings, Jesus shows his wounds to the disciples as a therapeutic or as a healing method, addressing the disciples' fear. What do you think are the essentials for constructing a healing grassroots community, a community of individuals who contribute to each other's healing process? That's one last question from Pak Didik, postgraduate student here at Jakarta Theological Seminary and a pastor at the Javanese Christian Church, GKJ.
That's such a great question. They're all great questions. So I'm wondering if you want me to just talk a little bit about that. It's the post-resurrection scene. Remind me again of the second part of the question, because I think there's a lot in there.
Right.
The implications for collective.
One moment. Oh, okay. Oh, here. Yeah. What are the essentials for constructing a healing grassroots community, or a community of individuals who contribute to one another's healing process?
Yeah, nice. So I would say some form of truth-telling. If denial is one of the aspects of, the not wanting to see, then one of the essentials is, I would ask, what are the conditions, staying with the biblical story, what are the conditions in that room, right? I would ask, what makes it possible for difficult truths to be surfaced? So if our collective tendency is to push the wounds back under the surface, right? Or make them tidy, like clean them up, or put a Band-Aid, right? Like a temporary fix. I think the question is, what are the conditions needed in order for, let's go back to the earlier question, the victim of sexualized violence to be safe again in a group, right? That to trust that she will not be harmed again. What are the conditions in that, what's essential for constructing a community of trust, of truth-telling, of transparency? One way I read that story of Thomas, it's not very popular, is that Thomas is a perpetrator. I mean, that Thomas is not just a doubter, he has to confront himself. Because in some ways, Thomas demands there's a power and control way of reading Thomas, right? There's different ways of reading the Thomas figure. And usually we say Thomas is the doubter, right? Who comes to belief when he sees the wounds. And one of the ways I read that, especially in relationship to race, in that middle chapter, is I say, Thomas actually demands to see the wounds, which is actually a move that somebody who has power, he says, I'm not going to believe until I see. That could be Thomas as like power and control Thomas. So if that's a post-resurrection scene, Jesus, the resurrected Christ, confronts Thomas, right? And shows him his desire to grab and control, right? So there's a confrontation that I think folds in a conflict. You need something in your essential toolbox, right? Essentials for constructing community, to how to see conflict, not as something to avoid, but conflict as capacity for change. So I'd say you'd need a set of skills to view conflict and confrontation, which none of us know how to do well. I was taught to be very nice, right? And my religious tradition taught me to pray and be nice, and didn't teach me a skill set to hold people accountable for behavior in the name of the Christian community. So how do we do that well? Most people have examples of how it's not done well, but if you're attending to trauma and tending and really confronting wounds, you have to figure out how to work with and through conflict.
Okay. I think that was the last question. Amadeo, teman-teman tidak semua bisa dijawab pertanyaan karena now is almost 11 p.m. Dreaming time supposedly for Professor Rambo already.
I go to bed very early.
You not
I
want
wake up early, go to bed early.
Yeah.
We're sorry to keep you awake.
It's okay. Next time we'll meet my morning, your evening.
Sure.
Noted.
Right?
Yes, it will happen next year.
9 o'clock at night for you.
Teman-teman, ini yang pertama untuk Pkgst mengadakan online conversation tema trauma teologi, tapi mulai tahun depan kami akan melakukannya sekali sebulan. Online conversation monthly. The overall theme on trauma and theology, but we can develop conversation into much more specifics. We hope to have Professor Rambo again next semester. We will have different guest speakers, of course. And if you want to suggest, themes or focus, or, feel free to email to Amadeo. I think he has the information in it. So we'll go through the list and we'll focus one, every month. So Amadeo, back to you.
Yeah. So, thank you both. I'm gonna speak in bahasa Indonesia now. Terima kasih teman-teman, ibu bapak, kakak adik, rekan-rekan semuanya yang telah hadir di acara pada pagi hari ini. Suatu kesempatan yang berbahagia sekali bisa bertemu dengan teman-teman semua ya, meskipun kita bertemu secara virtual. Dan sebagaimana dijelaskan oleh Kak Septemmy tadi, ini adalah pertemuan perdana dari sebuah program yang kita namakan diskusi bulanan tentang teologi trauma, dan program ini akan menjadi salah satu fokus program Pkgst juga tahun depan, teman-teman. Sebagaimana teman-teman ketahui, prospek acara ini begitu luas, begitu besar, dan acara ini juga tidak memungut biaya dan juga gratis. Namun kami akan sangat-sangat amat mengapresiasi teman-teman para sahabat STFT Jakarta yang ingin berkontribusi bagi pengembangan program-program seperti ini. Nah, teman-teman bisa langsung lihat di layar teman-teman, salah satu panitia, Patricia, sedang melakukan pembagian layar, screen sharing. Teman-teman bisa langsung scan di QRIS ini jika teman-teman ingin mendukung program-program kami di Pusat Kajian Gender, Seksualitas, dan Trauma STFT Jakarta. Sekali lagi teman-teman, terima kasih banyak. Thanks for coming, thanks for showing up, thanks for contributing and enriching this discussion. Terima kasih banyak Kak Septemmy Lakawa, terima kasih banyak Profesor Shelly Rambo. Thank you very much Professor Rambo for your
thank you
time.
so much.
But please don't leave, we're going to have group pictures, correct?
That's correct. Yeah, we can have a group picture.
Please don't leave. Everyone,
Okay.
if you know, you can open your camera if you want.
I was going to show Septemmy my dog.
Oh, please do.
A very happy dog. I put him in the other room so he didn't bark well.
Oke, kita akan mengambil foto, teman-teman. 1, 2. Sekali lagi.
Is it with everybody already? Can you take, because we're still having this spotlight.
Ah, I see.
Yeah, so everybody can be on the picture.
Right.
yes,
Actually, it's on gallery view already.
Okay.
There are 6 screens.
Okay, everyone, joy infusion.
Joy infusion.
1, 2, 3. Sekali lagi. 1, 2, 3. Sebentar, ini kenapa nggak bereaksi ya ininya ya? Coba aku. Mungkin Patricia boleh bantu screenshot nggak Patricia? Aku punya nggak bereaksi ini.
Kayak sih kali yang harus atur.
Kayak sih mana ya?
Kayak punya bergerak. Oke. Ada Kanti.
Oh.
Halo Dr. Rambo.
Kak Yesi udah ini kita bisa.
Oh, look at the baby.
Udah di foto, udah selesai?
Cantik. Sebentar saya lagi.
Oh, there's Ionia.
Yes. Hi Shelly. So nice seeing you again.
I need to come back.
Sudah? Oh sure.
Ada Panggalo.
Sudah? We're ready to.
Are we done pictures? Are we done pictures?
Yes.
Are we done?
There is Kartika also here. Kartika, Irene.
Oh, hi.
Yeah.
Okay. I should have gotten all my people from.
Okay.
I should have gotten all my BU people, but they've graduated. They're all.
Yeah.
All those people that you knew are gone.
Yeah. I saw them on FD.
All done. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Professor.
Thank you so
Love
much.
for Finn, yeah, Shelly. I love to see Finn.
Oh yeah, I'm gonna get Finn. Hold on 1 minute.
Okay, get him.
Okay. Terima
She's
kasih
so
banyak.
adorable.
Ini biasanya kalau 5 menit, 10 menit terakhir kita kayak begini, Kak Septemmy, kita ngobrol-ngobrol selalu.
Are
Okay.
you're gonna also see all my messy papers. Okay.